Hamas accuses Israel of reneging on ceasefire deal and resuming military offensive in Gaza. Families and tribal leaders in southern Gaza call for mass protests on Friday, demanding Hamas's removal from power. And US President Trump confirms ongoing successful discussions with Russia and Ukraine. Hello, good morning. It's 10 o'clock Cairo local time and you're watching Q News. We begin today's bulletin with the latest from Gaza. Hamas has announced receiving several proposals for a ceasefire in Gaza in recent weeks and responded with what it described as responsibility and openness. Hamas further accused Israel of reneging on an agreement previously signed between the two sides, saying the Israeli government refused to move to the second phase of the deal and has resumed its military offensive on the Gaza Strip. Families and tribal leaders in southern Gaza have called on residents across the Gaza Strip to take to the streets on Friday in mass protests demanding the removal of Hamas from power. In a public statement, they accused Hamas of harming Gaza's youth and exploiting them for political ends. The families stressed the need for a political solution that restores peace and security without further displacement or destruction, and urged Hamas members to abandon the group in favor of the national interest. Jordan's Foreign Minister Ayman al-Safadi has called for coordinated international efforts to stop Israeli military assault on Gaza. During a meeting in Amman with German Interior Minister Nancy Faeser and Austrian counterpart Gerhard Kahner, al-Safadi emphasized the need to impose a permanent and comprehensive ceasefire and to open border crossings for the delivery of humanitarian aid across the Strip. Thousands of Israeli protesters have gathered outside the Knesset calling for new elections and the return of detainees still held in Gaza. Among those attending was former Defense Minister Benny Gantz, who called it a very important demonstration. The protest coincided with parliamentary session debating a controversial bill to change the committee that appoints judges, a move critics say could trigger a constitutional crisis and expand government powers. It also came just one day after the Knesset narrowly approved the long-delayed 2025 state budget, following a heated debate that highlighted deep divisions over the detainees' fate and Israel's political future. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has warned that Israel could seize territory in Gaza if Hamas does not release the remaining detainees. Speaking at the Knesset, Netanyahu stated that increased force would be used, and the longer Hamas delays, the more powerful the repression. His remarks were repeatedly interrupted by opposition lawmakers, one of whom was removed after calling the Prime Minister an inciter.
בימים האחרונים ראינו עוד שינוי. ראינו דבר
To Yemen now, where US forces launched a series of airstrikes targeting Houthi-controlled areas around Yemen's capital Sana'a. That's according to Houthi-run media. The strikes hit multiple locations north and south of the city, including 8 strikes in the Jarban area of Sanhan district and 5 in the Bani Hashish district. The Dailami airbase, located north of Sana'a, was also targeted with 2 airstrikes. Now let's get the latest developments in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. US President Donald Trump has said Washington is in active and positive discussions with both Russia and Ukraine. The United States has confirmed reaching separate agreements with the 2 countries to ensure safe navigation in the Black Sea and to ban strikes on energy infrastructure. As part of the deal, Washington has agreed to push for the easing of some sanctions on Moscow, marking a notable step toward aligning with Russia's position. These agreements represent the first formal commitments between the warring sides since President Trump's return to office.
It's a situation we should have never had to even think about, should have never happened. And on the Middle East...
The United States has said it is still reviewing the agreements reached with both Ukraine and Russia earlier this week. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio clarified the deals were agreements in principle, noting that Washington is now evaluating the conditions laid out by Moscow before deciding on the next steps. Under the proposed deal, both Ukraine and Russia agreed to pause attacks at sea and on energy infrastructure. In return, the US signaled a willingness to push for the easing of some sanctions on Russia. However, shortly after the US announcement, the Kremlin responded, saying the agreement concerning the Black Sea would not take effect unless some Russian banks are reconnected to the international financial system.
So we can more fully understand what the Russian position is or what their ask is in exchange. And then we'll present that to the president, who will ultimately make a decision about.
French President Emmanuel Macron has announced that France will provide an additional 2 billion euros in military aid to Ukraine. Speaking alongside Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Paris, Macron said the new package includes anti-tank and surface-to-air missiles, armored vehicles, drones, and additional Mirage fighter jets. He also accused Russia of rewriting the terms of recent limited ceasefire agreements. The announcement comes ahead of a summit involving around 30 world leaders aimed at strengthening support for Ukraine, reviewing ceasefires, and discussing Europe's long-term role in supporting Ukraine.
Ou encore des missiles de défense solaire Mistral. Pour tenir sur le front, les armées ukrainiennes recevront également des blindés VAM, des chars AMX-10RC, mais également de nombreuses munitions, dont certaines téléopérées ou des drones. Et nous avons aussi avancé sur les coopérations en matière satellitaire ou d'intelligence.
Emmanuel Macron. Now, for his part, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has expressed hopes that the United States can exert enough pressure on Russia to secure an unconditional ceasefire. His remarks came after Moscow proposed conditions for halting strikes in the Black Sea under a deal brokered by Washington. Speaking at a joint press conference with French President Emmanuel Macron in Paris, Zelensky stressed that sanctions on Russia should not only remain in place, but be strengthened. Kyiv had earlier stated it was ready to implement the agreement immediately. The United Nations has called for increased aid to Ukraine during a Security Council meeting. Council members welcomed separate agreements struck by the United States and both Ukraine and Russia to pause attacks in the Black Sea and on energy infrastructure. However, comments from Moscow and Kyiv made it clear that significant differences remain. Russia's Deputy UN Ambassador, Dmitry Polyansky, stressed that the initiative would only resume once a series of measures are implemented.
On Ukraine's sovereignty, our domestic and foreign policies, including on the choice of alliances that we would like to join. Border regions, particularly
Sudan's Sovereign Council Chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan has announced that the army has fully gained control of the capital Khartoum. Speaking from the Republican Palace, al-Burhan declared the capital free of rapid support forces. The Sudanese Armed Forces also confirmed control over Khartoum International Airport, signaling a major shift in the power struggle that has gripped the country for months. The US Vice President J.D. Vance has said that he will visit Greenland this week, accompanying a high-profile US delegation to the territory that US President Donald Trump says Washington should take over. Trump has repeatedly said that the US should take over Greenland, claiming that the vast island was important for US national security. The governments of both Greenland and Denmark have voiced opposition to any US takeover. Polls have shown that nearly all Greenlanders oppose joining the United States.
Greenland have threatened to use its territories and its waterways to threaten the United States, to threaten Canada, and of course to threaten the people of Greenland.
Meanwhile, in Denmark, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen has said that the United States is exerting unacceptable pressure on Greenland. Frederiksen said the visit is clearly not about what Greenland needs or wants. She disputed the notion of a private visit with official representatives and said Denmark did not oppose ties with the United States, citing a 1951 bilateral agreement which established US rights to move freely and construct military bases in Greenland, given Denmark and Greenland are notified.
Så bliver jeg også nødt til at sige, at det er et uacceptabelt pres, der bliver lagt både på Grønland og Danmark i den her situation.
Furthermore, Denmark has welcomed a US decision to limit a planned visit to Greenland to a military base, following tensions over what Copenhagen called political pressure on the semi-autonomous territory. The controversy began with Usha Vance, the wife of US First President J.D. Vance, the second lady, was scheduled to attend a major dog sled race in Greenland. Denmark's Prime Minister called the move unacceptable. The White House later announced J.D. Vance himself would lead the delegation, but only visit the US space base at Pituffik. Denmark's Foreign Minister called the move a positive step towards de-escalation.
Og selvfølgelig er det den grønlandske folk, som bestemmer deres fremtid.
For his part, President Donald Trump has said the US annexation of Greenland is vital to national security as Vice President J.D. Vance prepares for the official visit to the island.
We need Greenland for national security and international security. So I think we'll go as far as we have to go. We need Greenland. And the world needs us to have Greenland, including Denmark. Denmark has to have us have Greenland. And, we'll see what happens. But if we don't have Greenland, we can't have great international security. If you look at the ships outside of Greenland, China, Russia, places that we have to be there. If we're not there, we can't have national or international security. So I view it from a security standpoint, we have to be there.
President Donald Trump there. Istanbul's City Council has elected an interim mayor after opposition mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu was jailed pending trial on corruption charges he and his supporters strongly deny, calling them politically motivated. His arrest sparked the largest anti-government protests in Turkey in over a decade, with hundreds of thousands taking to the streets in mostly peaceful demonstrations. The opposition-led council elected Nuri Aslan of the CHP as interim mayor, winning 177 out of 314 votes. Aslan will lead the city until İmamoğlu's trial concludes. South America and Peruvian President Dina Boluarte has called for general elections to be held on April 12, 2026, saying she hoped the vote would put an end to a period of instability. Bulletin also highlighted that the call will prevent investments from stopping in the country. Bulletin took office in 2022 after her predecessor, former President Pedro Castillo, was removed from office after trying to dissolve the Congress. Bulletin was serving as vice president and is due to finish a 5-year term in office after the previous elections in 2021.
Así como a los diputados y senadores del futuro Congreso bicameral.
Germany has expressed disappointment over the United States' decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, pointing to America's historic role as the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter. Speaking at the Petersburg Climate Conference in Berlin, Chancellor Olaf Scholz emphasized that walking away from the accord undermines global efforts to combat climate change. The criticism follows a series of regulatory rollbacks announced by the Trump administration, including the repeal of emissions limits on power plants and vehicles and reduced protections for waterways, moves aimed at boosting fossil fuel and industrial production.
Eines der wichtigsten sicherheitspolitischen Themen überhaupt. Das sagen nicht nur Klimaschützer, sondern auch unsere
Bolivian President Luis Arce has declared a national emergency after torrential rains and severe flooding left more than 50 people dead and displaced over 100,000 across the country. All 9 of Bolivia's regions have been affected, with 1 declared a disaster zone and 3 others placed under a state of emergency. The rainy season in Bolivia typically runs from November to March, but officials say the severe weather has persisted into late March and may continue into April. The state of emergency will allow the government to speed up aid efforts and deploy additional resources. Thousands of soldiers have already been sent to assist in the worst-hit areas. Now let's go into Selma Marwan in our newsroom. Selma, what do you have for us?
Thank you, Mark. And now we move to the economic news, where we present you with the latest developments and insights around the world. U.S. President Donald Trump has announced new tariffs of up to 25% on automotive imports, escalating the global trade war he reignited after returning to the White House this year. The tariffs set to take effect on April 2nd are part of a broader strategy to revive U.S. manufacturing and reduce the trade deficit. Additional reciprocal tariffs targeting key trade partners are expected the same day. The move has sparked concern across the auto industry, with experts warning of higher prices and disrupted production. Shares of major U.S. automakers dropped following the announcement. Canada is preparing to respond to new tariffs on imported vehicles announced by U.S. President Donald Trump, with possible retaliatory measures under consideration. Prime Minister Mark Carney stated that the move poses a serious threat to the North American auto industry and confirmed he will convene a high-level cabinet meeting on Thursday to finalize Canada's response. Ottawa has already outlined a $155 billion package of counter tariffs, which would be implemented in phases depending on Washington's actions. While no specific timeline was given, officials say a decision is expected soon.
In the process of being broken.
As Canada braces for new U.S. tariffs under President Donald Trump, a Toronto fair is urging consumers to buy locally and support homegrown businesses. The one-of-a-kind show, now in its 49th year, features over 400 Canadian artisans and has become a platform for the growing Buy Canadian movement. While some vendors say they're shielded from direct tariff impacts by sourcing and producing locally, concerns remain for those with American customers. The event highlights rising public support for domestic products during a time of economic uncertainty. China has condemned the United States for adding dozens of Chinese entities, including 6 subsidiaries of cloud computing giant Inspur Group, to its export restriction list. The foreign ministry in Beijing called the move unjustified and said it would take necessary measures to protect the rights and interests of Chinese businesses. The announcement comes amid growing tensions between the two countries over trade, technology, and national security, as Washington continues to target Chinese firms with sanctions and export controls. Iran's currency has plunged to a record low of 1,039,000 riyals to the US dollar, losing more than half of its value since President Masoud Pezeshkian took office in August. The drop comes amid growing tensions with the United States over Iran's nuclear program. Diplomatic efforts have stalled, raising fears of potential conflict. With annual inflation around 40%, many Iranians are turning to foreign currencies and gold to protect their savings, adding further pressure on the rial. In 2018, the rial traded at 55,000 to the dollar before U.S. sanctions were reimposed. Tesla is set to launch in Saudi Arabia for the first time, with the debut event scheduled in Riyadh on April 10, according to an update on the company's website. While Tesla already operates in parts of the Middle East, it has not entered the region's largest market until now. The launch comes as Tesla faces declining sales in Europe and growing controversy in the United States, where CEO Elon Musk has drawn criticism over political ties and government cuts. And now we go back to Mark in our studio.
Thank you very much, Selma, and more from Selma here on Qnews later on this morning. And that brings us to the end of our bulletin, but let's first of all recap this morning's main headlines. Hamas accuses Israel of reneging on ceasefire deal and resuming military offensive in Gaza. Families and tribal leaders in southern Gaza call for mass protests on Friday, demanding Hamas's removal from power. And US President confirms ongoing successful discussions with Russia and Ukraine. And that's all for now. Don't forget you can follow Qnews on our social media platforms at QNewsEGY. Thank you very much for watching and stay tuned for more here on Qnews.